The following's intended solely for the use of those with a sense of adventure.
I'm shaking the dust of this town off my feet, and I'm going to see the world.
This is Travel with Hawkeye. Here's your host, Mark Hawkeye Lewis.
One of my favorite cities to visit, and one city that I believe that every American should visit, is Washington, D.C. And with the World Series and the Washington Nationals making headlines, I thought it might be fun to kind of explore that city. So I asked Rob Pitingalo from TripHacksDC to join us and delve into this city, which has changed so much since the last time I was there, and which is embarrassing, was back in the 80s. And Rob, welcome to the show. First, can we just start, first of all, what's happened with the Washington Nationals and the area where they built their stadium? Because that area has been transformed.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible what's happened over there. The team's been here for 11 years, so this is year number 11 since Nationals Park opened. They played at a different park for a few years while it was under construction. And for the most part, it's, a completely new area. It looks completely different than it did 10 years ago. It looks completely different than it did 5 years ago. Yeah,
I remember going on Google Maps when it was built because I'm a big baseball fan, and I love architecture, baseball stadium architecture. And I thought, wow, this was kind of in the middle of kind of a really dead area of Washington, D.C. By some naval yards. And now when you watch the game on TV, you can see like out in the outfield, condos and all sorts of things. And it's like, wow, this is a real vibrant neighborhood now.
Absolutely. Cranes are everywhere. There's folks who do the crane counter, and at any given time it could be a dozen or so cranes in that neighborhood alone. And, the unfortunate thing about the area was that the park opened in 2008, which as many folks probably know, was right around the time the Great Recession was hitting and housing market problems were hitting. So there was a development right across the street from the ballpark, and it was going to be on a street called Half Street. And unfortunately, the financing dried up after they had dug the giant hole to start the project. So for many, many years after the ballpark opened, people would walk past what they called the Half Street hole to get into the ballpark. And it was really awful and embarrassing. And infamously, one of the team's owners kind of complained at one point that the Nationals were never going to get the All-Star game because this thing was so embarrassing. It was right across the street from the park. And we did last year. We did get the All-Star game. And now the Half Street Hole is about to open as a brand new apartment and condo building.
Oh, very good. Very good. You know what? It's interesting, too, because there's not really that many cities that have been that successful in transforming a neighborhood. Denver did a great job with their stadium downtown in a section that they call Lodo, or lower downtown. Here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where I live, the stadium was built back in 1994, and they promised all this development, and there's nothing around the stadium 25 years later, and they're actually moving to a new stadium across the street. And so, it's tough to do that, and it really worked well for Washington, D.C.
That's right. I was just talking to one of my guests on my podcast about the experience that you get when you go to a Nationals game, and we kind of contrasted it actually with going to a Rangers game.
Oh,
when you go to a Rangers game, you get in your car, you drive. Yes. There's a massive parking lot. You pay money, you park your car, you go straight into the park. Game's over, you go back to your car, you drive to wherever you're going. Whereas here, most people are not arriving by car. They're arriving by metro, or they're biking to the park, or they're just walking from their hotel, and they're checking out the neighborhood. They're going to one of the parks nearby. They're eating at a restaurant. The Nationals actually let you bring your own food into the park, which is a great perk that not all MLB teams allow. And so people are going to one of the local restaurants and bringing it right into the game, which is a great experience.
Well, speaking of that, I'm going to piggyback that on just Washington, D.C. as a whole. And I said at the beginning that it's one of my favorite cities, but I have not been there since 1984. So it's been a very long time. And I'm going to be honest, in 1984, not unlike New York City, Washington, D.C., the city, the actual city itself was probably not at a high point. Of course, you're always going to have the great monuments and the mall and everything, but the city surrounding it was really kind of had declined, like a lot of American cities in the 80s. I have to imagine that Washington, D.C. is quite different now in 2019.
That is absolutely true. It's a lot different now than it was in the 80s. It's a lot different now than it was in the 90s. It's a lot different now than it was in the 2000s, to be completely honest. And when I give my tours, a lot of folks are kind of surprised to learn that Washington, D.C. has not always been a tourist destination. Back in the 60s, it was just a sleepy little town where government employees lived and worked, and that was about it. We've always had some monuments, but the Vietnam Memorial, for example, didn't open until 1982. And that was really the one that started the whole boom of building these monuments and memorials that you come to Washington, D.C. now and you just expect to see. And you kind of feel like they've always been there, but the reality is that they're a fairly recent phenomenon.
Well, it's kind of, to be honest, that's kind of hard for me to believe that Washington, D.C. has always been kind of sleepy, because they've always had like great museums like the Smithsonian and so forth, have they not?
Yeah, the museums have been here, and the idea of Washington, D.C. being a sleepy city kind of goes back to the very early Founding Fathers days, and folks who have seen the play Hamilton might be able to appreciate the tension between people like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson over the idea of, well, should the capital of the country be New York City, the big bustling city just like London and the other world capitals, or should it be a smaller place where you're really focused on running the government and not a lot else? And so that's kind of how it wound up. And nowadays it's a lot different. It's a big world city, but it really has not always been like that, especially for a big chunk of our country's history.
Well, it's interesting. I remember back in the 80s, my uncle lived in Maryland, obviously just north of Washington, D.C., and we took a drive. We went to the Smithsonian, and we took a drive back to his house. And we drove through some sections of Washington, D.C. that had these beautiful brownstones, and they were in disrepair, and the neighborhood wasn't very good. And I remember telling my uncle, I go, man, these buildings are beautiful. You could probably get these for a song and fix this up. And he goes, I've always thought the same. And I have to imagine that if I drove through that same neighborhood, and forgive me, I'm not sure what neighborhood it was, but those type of dwellings are probably, as I predicted, renovated and probably very expensive now, not unlike Brooklyn.
Absolutely. There's a neighborhood called Capitol Hill, as the name suggests. It's right next to the U.S. Capitol. And if you were here in the 80s, chances are that you saw those big, beautiful homes, and many of them were in disrepair. And folks who bought those in the 90s, they look like geniuses now, because, you go to that neighborhood now and you want to buy that house, it's $1 million or more. And, people think, well, how could this have how could it have ever been anything other than this? Because it's so beautiful. It's that iconic Washington, D.C. row house. Many of them are the Victorian style. And even a central area like Capitol Hill, right next to the U.S. Capitol, if you go back to the Library of Congress archives and look up photos of the neighborhood, I think you might be shocked to see that it definitely doesn't look like the way that it looks today.
Well, has Washington, D.C. become, I know there's a lot of attractions. We're going to talk about some more of them in just a second here. But it has become a city where people like to visit those neighborhoods, like in towns like Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. Are those homes, do people tour them? Do they tour those neighborhoods?
It's, yes, definitely a place where people want to see. I think people who come, especially for the first time, tend to focus really heavily on the central core, the monuments, the National Mall, the museums. And maybe for folks who are visiting for a second time, or they've seen this stuff, in the past, they want to see a little bit more. They want to venture out a little bit. They'll go to a neighborhood like Capitol Hill. They'll go to a neighborhood like Georgetown. Georgetown, for example, is one of the most popular neighborhoods for visitors, and there are many tour companies who run a Georgetown walking tour, because there's so many different pieces of history that are over there that you can check out. Just walk in up and down the streets, up through the neighborhood.
All right, let's talk about some of the other things in Washington, D.C. that they're more known for. Let's start with the Washington Monument, which I don't know if it just reopened or was just renovated recently, but I know they've been working on it for a long time to stabilize it and create a better experience, correct?
Yeah, so this has had a bit of a tortured history in the last decade or so. In 2011, there was an earthquake in Virginia, and we don't get a lot of earthquakes here in our part of the country, so this was very sorry for the pun, very shocking and surprising for a lot of people who weren't used to this. I know when I was in my office building, people didn't know what to do. We had some folks who previously lived in California who knew exactly what to do, but many of us were completely clueless because we don't get a lot of earthquakes. And unfortunately, because the Washington Monument's really the only tall building in the city, and because it opened in the 1880s, it was pretty severely damaged during the earthquake. So they had to spend several years doing a major earthquake repair and renovation. And so if you came in the 2011 or the couple of years after that, you might remember the big scaffolding that was up around it. And
yes,
that was specifically to repair the earthquake damage. Then it reopened, and I was very lucky. I went up the Washington Monument during the period when it was reopened after that. And the elevator is actually pretty old, and turns out that you're supposed to replace an elevator in a building every, so many years, just like you're supposed to replace the roof on your house or your furnace. And the elevator was pretty old, and it was not in the best shape, and people were getting stuck in the elevator, which is not an experience that I think a lot of people want to have when they come to Washington, D.C. So the most recent project was to completely redo the elevator. They built a new building on the outside of the monument that is sort of the security area. So now you've got all the metal detectors. It's kind of amazing to think that for all those years after 2001, we, didn't have any metal detectors at the Washington Monument, even though they were everywhere else in the city. But now we do have them, so you got to go through your security screening when you go up to the Washington Monument. But just last month, it finally reopened. People are thrilled. They're finally able to go inside and go up to the top once again.
Are there people that are surprised that you could even go to the top of that monument?
Oh, absolutely. When I take folks on tour, that's one of the most popular questions is, hey, can I actually go inside there? Can I go up to the top? And so, yeah, of course you can. Now, it's if you don't make a reservation in advance, and I highly recommend making a reservation in advance, there's a website called recreation.gov where you can make a reservation for the Washington Monument. But if you didn't do that, you're not a listener to your show and a planner, then you can show up at the Washington Monument every morning. 8:30 a.m. is when they distribute the tickets for the day. But, of course, people show up there a lot earlier because they want their first pick at what time they go.
I remember when I went there in 1984, I remember just walking by it and seeing there was a park ranger there. And I said, can I go up in this? He goes, yeah. It was probably 4:45 in the afternoon. He goes, well, one more elevator up. And there was no line. And like I said, this was a long time ago. I just walked in. I didn't even know you could go up in this. He goes, we hear that all the time. Went up in it. Great view. Enjoyed it immensely. Came down. And that was my experience in Washington Monument. So I assume it sounds like if you've got to make reservations or get there at 8:30 in the morning, it's probably a lot different now.
This is the biggest difference between the 1980s and the 2010s, or at least 2019, is our tourism industry is quite mature, but it's pretty new as well. So not a lot of people were visiting Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. And the tour that I run the most often, the Monuments Memorials Tour, that tour couldn't have existed in 1984 because there just weren't enough monuments yet. So it's not surprising to me in the least to hear that you could do that. Another thing we find is if you want to tour inside the White House now, it's this awful process. You've got to contact your Congress member. You've got to wait forever. And then most folks find out 2 weeks before their trip that they got rejected anyway. But back in the 80s, you want to go inside, show up on 15th Street.
Yes.
And, as soon as the line's short enough, you go in. And so that's a big difference between visiting now and visiting before. And I think the thing is, these places are not meant to be attractions, right? Like the Washington Monument in the 1880s, they had a hard time imagining that anyone would even want to go up to the top. And, that the idea that you would come to Washington, D.C. and everybody would want to go inside the White House was just not something that they really imagined back in those earlier days would be an attraction in the way that it is today.
It's interesting, too. A lot of people don't know this. I saw this on your site, but I actually did know this, that until I'm not going to spoil what passed it, but for many years, that was the tallest structure in the world.
Yeah, it wasn't a lot of years, but it was, when it opened, the tallest building in the world. And the most interesting thing to me about that fact is that the construction was delayed significantly, right, because of the Civil War, money problems, other things that were happening at that period of history. And so if they had built that thing in any reasonable amount of time, it would have been the tallest building in the world for decades, perhaps, but wound up only being the tallest in the building for a few years.
Okay, I did not know for a few years, but tell everybody what surpassed it, because that in itself is quite an impressive structure.
Yeah, the Eiffel Tower was the building that became the tallest building in the world when it opened in 1889. And what's fascinating to me about the Eiffel Tower is that it's way taller than the Washington Monument. So it's not like they just, beat it by 5 or 10 feet and called it a day. I mean, the Eiffel Tower is huge. And I'm not an expert on Paris history, but I've learned over the years that the people in Paris hated the Eiffel Tower when it opened. They thought it was the ugliest place in the world. And if you owned a house in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower in the 1890s, you went broke because nobody wanted to buy your house. And now it's funny because that's the most valuable real estate in the whole city, if not in the whole country of France. But for a long time, it was really, really despised.
Oh, yeah. People wanted it taken down. In fact, they were promised that it would be taken down shortly after the World's Fair. But then radio was invented and it became a radio tower for a while also. So it ended up staying. And now it's the most visited place in the world. So, it just goes to show you just never know how, people are going to fall in love with something. It's the international symbol of Paris. Also, speaking of, I saw this on your website. I did not know this. At the very top of the Washington Monument, there's a small piece of aluminum.
Yeah, aluminum was a newly discovered precious metal back then. And so there's a lot of different ideas about why they chose to put this up there. Some people say that it's out of respect for, our great founding father, George Washington. Other people said it was a sort of investment that would appreciate over time. And if, anything ever happened and we needed little extra money, we could call on that. But regardless of the reason, they put aluminum at the top. And at the time, in the 1880s, aluminum cost the same price per ounce as silver. So it wasn't, a bad idea at the time, but now we look back on it and we think it's silly because we're drinking Coke out of aluminum cans and we're wrapping up our leftover pizza in aluminum foil. So it doesn't look like the investment turned out so well, but I get it. I get why they did it.
It's so funny too. I mean, if the people who built that knew where aluminum would be going, it would be, I think they would be shocked. Like, seriously? I mean, how can that be? It's a very precious metal. Well, you know what? You brought up something very interesting that I did not know, that in the 1980s, there weren't really very many tourist attractions in Washington, D.C. itself. But now there's a lot more. Of course, the most famous, the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial. And a lot of people don't know that these are open 24/7. They never close.
That's right. And one question that people always ask as soon as we arrive at the Lincoln Memorial on my tour, because I often do a tour either in the morning, afternoon, or evening, and it's always packed. There's always so many people there, and they say, oh, man, this is kind of disappointing. This isn't like those photoshopped pictures I saw on Instagram. And then they say, well, when can I come back? When can I see it without the people? And my answer is, I don't know, because every time I'm here, it always looks like that. But maybe if you're a night owl, try 3 a.m. because I imagine there's not too many people up and about at 3 or 4 a.m. who are going to come and see it. So they're open 24 hours. They're lit up in the evening and at night. And if you're a night owl and you want to do a nighttime tour or crawl of the monuments, you're more than welcome to do that.
What is the condition right now of the Jefferson Memorial? Because many years ago, I remember reading that there were some foundation issues. It's a very old building. So have they renovated that in the last 20 years?
So if you show up right now, you're going to see scaffolding up all around the Jefferson Memorial. Now, the good news is that the main chamber where Thomas Jefferson's statue is still open to the public. It's still accessible. But, your photos are kind of ruined if you're trying to get a nice photo across the tidal basin because of all the scaffolding. And they're really doing a pretty significant roof repair right now. So there's two things that are going on. One is that the roof is just in need of repair. It's starting to leak. Water's starting to get through. And so they're needing to do some new waterproofing on the roof. And then the other is that there's something growing on the top that's called biofilm. And I'm not a chemist or biologist, so I can't fully explain what this is, but it's a microorganism. From a distance, it looks like dirt. And so you look at it and you say, hey, they got to get the power washer up there and, get that stuff off. But it's not dirt, so you can't wash it off that way. And so they are in the process of using a laser technology to remove it from the top of the Memorial Dome. But the big debate is whether that biofilm is actually good or bad. Some people think it might actually be protecting the stone. And so they're not 100% sure that removing it is actually the right thing to do. But it does look a lot nicer when it's, white and clean and doesn't have that stuff on there.
Very interesting. Well, let's talk about some of the other memorials and monuments that are in Washington, D.C. now that have been built in the last 20 or 30 years, since I've been there in the 80s. I do remember the Vietnam Veterans Memorial just being opened. And what an attraction that was. I hate to even call it an attraction, but just the amount of people that came that. It really kind of actually had a big healing process for the nation. People went there to find relatives and friends who were listed on the wall. Is it still like that so many years later?
So for a lot of years, the National Park Service said that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was the most visited memorial in Washington, D.C. And I remember there was actually a question on Jeopardy one year where, it was about the most visited memorial, and the answer was the question was the Vietnam Memorial rather. And so it's very busy even to this day. One thing that I think makes it tough is that unlike, say, the World War II Memorial, which was built in 2004 and was built to accommodate large crowds of veterans, the Vietnam Memorial is a lot smaller. So even when you have the same number of people there, it feels very busy and very crowded all the time. And at the time when it opened in 1982, it was very different from all the other memorials that were around. I mean, if you think of what the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial all have in common, well, they're all big and white, and they're rising up into the sky. And then what does the Vietnam Memorial look like? Well, it's made out of dark stone, and it's kind of buried down in the ground. And so it was, in many ways, the anti-memorial. It was the complete opposite of what we had known as a memorial. But that sort of goes along with that healing process. The designer has kind of described that design as like a wound in the earth that we're all there to help heal.
It was very controversial when it was built, too, the design.
Oh, yeah. I think for several years in the 80s and maybe even beyond, veterans were generally not fans of the design. And if you come here now on Memorial Day weekend and you go down there and you ask some of the vets who are visiting what they think of the memorial, I mean, they're very proud of it. They're very, proud of the fact that they can come and use that as a meeting space. And so I think they sometimes say time heals, but I think it's definitely changed. The opinion of the memorial has changed over these years.
Yeah, but I remember actually after it was built, they decided to add the statue nearby of the veterans, and that was not part of the original design from the architect, but people felt it needed something else. They felt it was just too stark. And the interesting thing, too, is I think I read this on your site, how the architect who designed that, she was a student at Yale, and her professor actually also had a design. She beat out her own professor?
That's right. I mean, there's lots of urban legends about this professor and what grade he gave her on the project, because the reason why she designed this Vietnam memorial was because it was a class project. All the students taking that course were, for their final project, going to design a Vietnam memorial to the specifications of the contest, and then she won the whole thing. So I always say that, who cares about the grade? This is the grade that matters, the fact that you won the contest, and really impressive for someone who at the time was not even a professional.
There's a bunch of others that have been built since I last visited, the Korean War Memorial, the World War II Memorial, Martin Luther King, and I believe Franklin Roosevelt also have now memorials in Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
Yes, all correct. The newest of those is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. That one opened in 2004. And what I tell people on my tour about that one is that, we created the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday back in the 80s. And once you've got a holiday, you're kind of a lock for a memorial in some ways, but deciding that someone's deserving of a memorial is kind of the easy part of the process, and deciding where it's going to go and what it's going to look like, that's when things start to get a little sticky, when all the opinions start to come out and fighting and bickering over the location and the design. So that one opened in 2004. That is in 2011. That is the newest on the tour that I give. And then in 2004, we opened the newest war memorial, which is the World War II Memorial.
Okay. Well, a friend of mine went to the Korean War Memorial, and he said he was really impressed with the design of that. Can you explain what that looks like and why so many people walk away just astonished by that?
So the Korean War Memorial features 19 Korean War soldiers walking through what's meant to look like a rice field. And there's a dark granite wall behind them, and that wall reflects those 19 statues. So the reason they did that is because the designers really wanted to incorporate the number 38 into their design. 38th parallel, and 38 months is how long the fighting lasted between 1950 and 1953. And the reason why I personally describe it as feeling very haunting is because as you walk through the memorial, there's always one soldier who's looking right at you. And so you can look back at him, you can see a look of fear in his eyes, because these rice fields were often loaded with landmines, and to walk through a rice field on the Korean Peninsula back then was putting your life at risk. And these guys would have to do this, on a regular basis. And so you kind of walk through the memorial and you feel like there's always someone watching you, or you're under surveillance or something like that.
Yeah, I think he described it like that himself. Wow, you kind of gave me chills, man, just talking about the memorial. I haven't seen it yet, and I've always wanted to go there. What about the World War II Memorial? Now, there was a bit of a controversy because where it was placed when they added that to the mall.
Yeah, there was a few controversies. One was the fact that spot had often been used for, political gatherings, protests, that sort of thing. And, with a war memorial, especially like a World War II memorial, you don't want to have people showing up and, doing that sort of thing on that location. But another reason it was opposed was because it's right in between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. And some people thought, well, if we put a memorial there, it's going to ruin the view. You stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and you get that beautiful postcard view of the city with the Washington Monument in the background. And the designers if you design a memorial, you're already a brilliant architect. But what they did that to me is just astonishing is that they put the memorial several feet below ground. So if you're over on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you look right through and you basically see nothing. It's basically hidden in plain sight. It's invisible. But if you're over on the grounds of the Washington Monument and you're looking in the other direction, you can't miss the place because it's got the fountains and it's all, all there in all of its glory. And so to me, that's really amazing about the design. But to, address the concern that it was going to ruin the view, no views were ruined in the creation of that memorial, that's for sure.
Well, when you give a tour of the memorials, do you hit all those, or are there some that is there some that I've missed? I mean, are all the big ones on your tour?
Yeah, all the big ones are on my tour. It takes about 3 hours for us to see all of them. And, if you're self-guiding your own tour, it can take, between 3 and 5 hours, depending on your pace and if you know where stuff is, if you've got a good map. But yeah, it doesn't take that long to see them. The reason why it's a a good idea to take a tour, whether it's with me or anyone else, is because unlike the museums where you walk up to the exhibit and there's a card that explains exactly what you're looking at everywhere, there's no explanation for these memorials. And unless you studied in advance or you know what's going on, you get to the Vietnam Memorial and you say, okay, it's a wall full of names that doesn't look that special to me. And I think that's such a bummer because I've heard so many people say, I didn't like the Vietnam Memorial. And I ask, well, why? And they say, well, it's just a bunch of names. And I get that it's really, sobering to see all those names, but it didn't really feel like there was a lot else going on. And it's because the symbolism's hidden. It's packed in there. And, Maya Lin didn't win the contest because she just, sent in a drawing of a wall full of names. She described all the symbolism that went in there. And, to learn about that, I think, is what people walk away and they say, wow, that's really impressive. That is an award winner.
Now, if I were going to D.C. for the very first time, what would be on the top of the top of the list, things that someone who's never been to Washington, D.C. before should definitely spend their time seeing?
Well, you've got to see the monuments and memorials, like I said. The other thing that I always say is sort of a must-see is the Capitol. I mean, the Capitol is the legislative branch of our government, and the building itself is amazing. And we've got the Capitol Visitor Center now, which is a great addition because you can go in there and you can sign up to go around with a tour guide called a Red Coat. And, they're professionals. They know lots of history about the building. And it's just a very impressive place. So I always put that up there. And then if it's your first time, you're going to want to see some museums. Now, the trick is that there are so many museums and they're so huge that you can't do it all. So you've really got to be picky. And there's no shame in being picky because, if something sounds interesting to you, you should go see that thing, especially if it's a temporary or a rotating exhibit, because who knows, if you come back in the future, it might not be around anymore. So there is no must-see museum. The must-see museum is the one that after you go on the Smithsonian website and you look at the list of exhibits, you say, wow, that popped for me. I really think I should go see that.
Well, I've heard the Holocaust Memorial Museum is very impressive.
It is a must-see. Everyone should see it. It is an extremely important part of world history.
I don't mean to laugh, but as you just said, there's no must-see. But then this is the must-see, though.
Well, it's a must-see, maybe not on your first time. Maybe it's something that you don't, if the kids are too young to appreciate it.
I see.
Because it's extremely heavy. And that's the thing that I try to advise people when they ask is I say, you want to see it because it's an important part of world history that we should all learn about. But if your goal for your trip is to just have a really fun trip, then this might not, be part of that fun trip because it's not a fun experience. And that doesn't mean it's a bad one. It doesn't mean it's one that you shouldn't have. It's just about kind of how you're coming to the city to experience things. Yeah.
What about the Museum of African American History and Culture?
That, in my opinion, is the best museum in the city. And I say that because I'm a huge history buff. And the amount of history that Smithsonian was able to acquire is just absolutely amazing. And, my favorite museums are the African American History Museum and the American History Museum because I'm a history guy. But I am just fascinated by how much they were able to acquire for that museum. They really did an amazing job building that place. Right now, you do need a timed ticket, depending on what day of the week and time of the year that you come. We're recording this now in October, and they're doing a walk-up weekday right now. So if you come on a weekday, you don't need a timed ticket. But if you come on the weekend, then you do. And next spring, I think they're going to reevaluate and decide whether they're going to keep that system. And the reason they're doing that is because it's new and it's amazing. So many people want to go. They're trying to keep the crowds manageable, make the experience a good one for people who come and visit. Well,
good deal. Well, as people are watching the World Series and they're thinking, you know what, I need to take a trip to Washington, D.C., I hope they find our podcast or at least your website, TripHacksDC, one of these two, and they're inspired to visit our nation's capital and just have a fabulous time. Man, I want to go back now because just talking to you, there's so much I haven't seen since I was there in the 80s. It's brand new to me, and it just it still amazes me that this city is never really, at the beginning, wasn't really thought of as a tourist attraction. I think it should be one of the top stops for every American.
Well, I'm glad you think that because we're not one of the busiest cities. New York City, I think, gets, according to the official statistics, 3 times as many people every year than we do. Orlando, Florida gets a whole lot more people than we do. Of course, people want to go see the mouse, but and it's hard to compete with that. But this is a place where the tourism industry is growing, and I'm very happy about that as a member of the industry. But yeah, it should be a must stop for every American.
All right. The website's called TripHacksDC.com. Highly recommend that. Even if, like Rob said, even if you don't want to hire him as a private tour guide, there's other tour guides also, but there's also a lot about trip planning on his website. I found out so much information about the monuments, and it'll make you want to go to Washington, D.C. even more, in my opinion. And also got a podcast there to check out. So continued success, Rob, and next time I come to Washington, D.C., which hopefully will be this summer, I'll definitely look you up.
Sounds good.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I do. Rob Pitingalo from TripHacksDC on the Travel with Hawkeye podcast. I'm Mark Hawkeye Lewis.